All right. Good evening. You might turn it, yeah. Just a little bit. Yeah, that's good. Good evening. We're in the book of Zechariah. We are jogging through. It's going relatively quickly comparatively. We actually covered a couple of chapters last week. We'll start in at the end of the third chapter tonight. One of the major things that we've been kind of talking and focusing about is the fact that this being written towards the end of the sort of Jewish era of having prophets. There was a lot that they needed to look forward to for the coming of Christ, and so there's a lot of messianic overtones to what we read, and a lot of things that are specifically pointing forwards to a new kingdom and a new, the Messiah and those kinds of things that are sprinkled throughout the rest of the Old Testament, but a little bit more concentrated here. And so that'll be something that we continue to look through. Before we go into it, though, let's start with a word of prayer. Our Lord and Father, we're so thankful that we have the opportunity to be here, to study your word, to look into the words that your faithful servants had transcribed for thousands of years to bring forth your will and your word to those who would seek you out. Help us to be seekers of truth, that we would look to your wisdom and your words, that we might gather the knowledge and the understanding that we need to live our lives properly before you, that we may be pleasing to you, and that we may give you glory in all that we do. For we pray in Christ's name. Amen. So, last week we started talking about the idea of everybody coming back in the second chapter, right? The idea was when Jeremiah said, flee, get out of the city, and then when he was talking to the exiles, he said, go build houses and live in them, right? Well, this is the opposite of that, right? This is a post-exilic period. The 70 years are over, and Zechariah says, come back, right? He says, in verse 6 of chapter 2, he says, oh, there, flee from the land of the north, for I have dispersed you as the four winds. So almost the same language of flee, right? But instead of fleeing from Jerusalem, it's flee from the land of the north. And then he talks about bringing everyone back to Zion, and that the Lord is going to be the wall and the safety around Jerusalem. And then he starts talking about Joshua the high priest, who he's reinstating. And there was that whole very interesting vision and discussion that you can either look back at last week's notes or just read it again to kind of refresh yourself on this whole idea of Satan accusing him and Joshua and having no defense of his own, but that the Lord reaches out from the fire and plucks Joshua out and cleanses him and says, I'm gonna make you clean again, and you're gonna be a high priest before me, but you have a job to do, right? And so at the end of that chapter, we'll kind of covered it a little bit last week, but I'd like to go over it again. He says, now listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your friends. We're in chapter 3, verse 8 here. Now listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you. Indeed, they are men who are a symbol. Behold, I am bringing in my servant, the branch. For behold, the stone that I have set before Joshua, on one stone are 7 eyes. Behold, I will engrave an inscription on it, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and under his fig tree. So there's a lot of very dense and encapsulated language in those 3 verses. And I want to cover that for a little bit because I think that then it sort of pushes into what we're going to see in chapter 4 specifically as sort of a theme that we're going to get going here. But first of all, I want to look at the middle. And he says, I have set a stone before him and inscribed something on it. Now, where have we seen the Lord inscribe stone before? Yeah, probably the first thing that comes to mind is the Ten Commandments, right? Now, there's other times that there was, not the Lord specifically, but Mount Gerizim, where they inscribed the words of the law. But when he talks about this one, there's a little bit of a twist to it. He says there's 7 eyes on this stone. Now, is the stone a living object that has eyeballs? Is it inscribed eyes? Well, no, he says he's inscribed an etching of words on it, right? He says, I will engrave an inscription. An inscription is a saying or a set of sentences or phrases or something like that. It's the idea there is he's putting actual language on the stone, not the eyes themselves. So what are the eyes? Just kind of thrown out there, right? It's in chapter 4, right? So we're going to have to get to that one, but keep that in mind, right? So that's one of the things that I want to call into focus here is he does a little bit of foreshadowing of the various things that he's going to then talk more about, but it can get very confusing if you try to look at it just in its very, 1 or 2 verses by itself kind of a thing, because it doesn't really explain it here. It just says, okay, this stone has eyes, and then it moves on and says the stone has an inscription. But I do think it's important, even before he gets on, to kind of look at that inscription, because what is he alluding to here when he's talking to Joshua? He says, you're a symbol, the people who are before you and around you are a symbol, in other words, the priesthood, but I'm going to put a new stone and inscribe something on it. And he just talked about bringing a branch. He's talking about a new law, right? Because while the stone tablet that was given to Moses, the 10 Commandments were not the entire law. We know that. There were books and books of various and sundry laws that were the actual capital L law. But the 10 Commandments were representative of that law, were they not? You could look at the 10 Commandments and that was a symbol of the old law. And therefore the stone that was inscribed was a symbol of the old law. And so he brings in a new symbol here and says, I'm bringing my branch and I will inscribe upon a stone that has these 7 eyes. So he's pointing forward very clearly to something law-related. Now, we can look back and say, this is looking forward towards the Messiah, towards Jesus, towards the coming of a new law, towards the coming of a new kingdom that is not the same as the Jewish law, right? But that's not the context they would have. All the context they would have, and the reason that I went in this order is because the only context they would have is what they had already seen before. These are people still living under the old law in Jerusalem, being administered by the high priests under the Judaic covenant, right? So what they're going to see is the stone tablets that are reminiscent of Moses' law, which very well to them might have meant, we're going to get a refreshing of things. We're going to get somebody like, when they look back now and they think of Ezra, who sort of brought the law back to them post-exile, that's maybe what they were thinking was the fulfillment here. But we understand it to be more. But that's only because we have the context of Jesus. Without the context of Jesus, this doesn't necessarily by itself speak volumes about the new law. It just points towards it, right? It points towards something coming. It points towards a new law. Now, the other piece of it, though, that I find very interesting, he says, in that one day I will remove the iniquity of the land. And that's super cool because, again, we start to think of Jesus' sacrifice being the ultimate sacrifice, taking away all of sin, and we understand that context, and that is what it is pointing towards. But what also might they think of in their context? What day is very important to the Jewish people? Okay, Passover, but more importantly, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, right? And specifically, who is got a really big job on the Day of Atonement but the high priest, who goes into the most holy place and makes atonement for all the people's sins. So they're going to look at that in the context that they had. They're going to look at that as say, okay, we're talking about Joshua here. We're talking about a high priesthood here. We're talking about making atonement for the people's sins. Would they be correct? Yes. Is there a greater fulfillment of that same prophecy? Also, yes. And that's, I think, where we have to start understanding these things, is that it's not a dual meaning in sort of a double entendre kind of way where you go, ooh, that's cool because it has two meanings of a very worldly sort. It is more of a type and an antitype. It is the shadow of things to come. It is the pattern that God had put into play that he was going through and letting people understand the basic version of it and then building the real house on top of that. And that's so cool to me because it shows how consistent God is in how he goes about designing the relationship between him and his people.
I wonder how many of them would have thought about the stone that was going to be cut out of the mountain and it was going to...
Oh, like in Daniel? Yeah. So in Daniel, what she's referring to in Daniel 2 is the idea of the statue, right? So you've got the statue with the four parts, and then when you get down to the bottom, and it's got the feet of iron mixed with clay, and then there's stone cut out from the mountain and destroys this whole statue. And of course, that is directly referring to the coming of a new kingdom, and he even says there's a new kingdom coming, and that is extremely clearly talking about the Messiah. And by this point, Daniel has already prophesied and died. So his books are written and sealed. They exist. So that's fair game. For interpretation, that's fair game, right? So Revelation, not fair game. Does not exist yet at this time. But Daniel is. Now, the reason I bring up Revelation, though, is as we get into chapter 4, there's going to be a very interesting vision that we have to understand also means a very similar thing. And again, it's one of those where we can look at it and understand some things that they wouldn't necessarily have the context for, but the meaning ends up being the same, right? So in what we just covered from 8 through 10, does the meaning that they would have taken out of that differ significantly from the meaning that we take out of it? No, because it's still talking about the Lord being with them and taking away their iniquity and giving his presence to the high priest and having this relationship with the high priest. That's good. That is the Lord reaching out to his people, showing mercy, and being their God. And in their context, we're talking about the high priest and Yom Kippur and the idea of the reinstatement of the kinds of activities that hadn't happened in 70 years. Think about it. They were in Babylon with no temple, no holy place, and no access to a high priest. They could do none of the things that were realistically expected for a real Yom Kippur ceremony to occur. But now they have that. They're starting to rebuild. They were going to get to the point where it talks in chapter 4 about Zerubbabel finishing the temple, but okay, spoiler alert. But the idea here is we're coming up on a time when that will happen, and it will exist, and they can be in this law-abiding mode again, whereas previously they may have understood the law, but they literally, physically could not take part in some of those things. But now they're getting to a place where they could. That's wonderful. And we can look at it as a prophecy of something to come where Jesus fulfilled those things in a much greater capacity, but it still has the same meaning. It's still God extending his hand in mercy and working through a high priest who was Jesus instead of Joshua to bring about atonement. See how that works? Same meaning, slightly different context. Okay, let's move on to chapter 4. Any questions or comments before we do that? Okay, so this is why we set the stage, because the next one is a weird one. Now the angel who was speaking with me returned and roused me as a man who is awakened from his sleep, and he said to me, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see, and behold, a lampstand, all of gold, with a bowl on top of it, and its 7 lamps with 7 spouts belonging to each of the lamps which are on top of it. Also 2 olive trees by it, one on the right side of the bowl and one on the left side." And then I said to the angel who was speaking with me, saying, "What are these, my Lord?" So the angel who was speaking with me said, "Do you not know what these are?" And I said, "No, my Lord." And he said, "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. What are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become a plain, and he will bring forth the top stone with shouts of grace, grace to it." Also the word of the Lord came to me, saying, "The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will finish it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. For who has despised the day of small things? But these 7 will be glad when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These are the eyes of the Lord, which range to and fro throughout the earth." And then I said to him, "What are these 2 olive trees on the right of the lampstand and on its left?" And I answered the second time and said to him, "What are 2 olive branches which are beside the 2 golden pipes, which empty the golden oil from themselves?" And he answered me, saying, "Do you not know what these are?" And I said, "No, my Lord." And then he said, "These are the 2 anointed ones who are standing by the Lord of the whole earth." Now, the second time, he asks twice and gets an answer that's a little shorter, but the first time is the weird one. Because what is this vision? So we've got a bowl, and in the bowl is what? 7 lampstands. It's a little confusing, but yeah. Each of the lampstands also has a bowl, and in each of those bowls is oil coming from these 2 trees.
I get a visual of there being a large bowl with spouts coming into the smaller bowls.
Yeah, it could be that, or the 7 bowls. Unfortunately, our Bibles don't come with the illustrated version. The approved illustrated version, I should say. But either way, we've got a bowl, we've got 7 golden lampstands, and we've got 2 trees, right? Those are the major elements of this vision. Now, ding, 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 when I mentioned Revelation before, there's a reason for that, because something should be very familiar when you think of 7 golden lampstands. We go, oh, hey, Revelation 1, we start to get that vision of Jesus in the throne room and him walking among the 7 golden lampstands with the 7 stars and the song that I like to lead, actually. All of that is a very similar vision, and we'll come back to that in a second. But when he asks what the 7 golden lampstands are, what's the answer he gets first? Not the answer to that, right? And in fact, unless you're reading very carefully, he never really directly answers the 7 golden lampstands. You get the answer, and I think we can get that, but what does he talk about first? He talks about Zerubbabel. He says, I'm going to prophesy about Zerubbabel and what he's going to be doing. Now, what is that prophecy about? Building the temple. Now, what is occurring at the same time as Zechariah's prophecies? Haggai. And what's Haggai's whole job? Get the people to build the temple, right? So, Zechariah at the same time is prophesying and says, Zerubbabel is going to do that. What is a mountain before Zerubbabel? In other words, his stature is going to be great because he's carrying about the will of the Lord here. He's doing the right thing here. Now, who was Zerubbabel? He was the governor, right? So he's not a prophet. He's not a king. He's just kind of the local governor, leader guy. He's the mayor. But he was influential, and he kept his people on track and did the right thing in the face of adversity. And Zerubbabel's a really interesting story because you get pieces of it throughout history. What I find interesting is that Zerubbabel started at the end of Daniel, right? Because Zerubbabel leads the first group of captives back. There were 3 groups of captives that left, right, of which Daniel was in the first group, and then Ezekiel would have been in the second group, and then the third group was pretty ragtag. But you might consider Jeremiah being part of the third group, even though he goes to Egypt instead of Babylon. But think about it this way. We've got 3 groups that go off to exile, and everybody else comes back at the same time, right? No. They also come back in waves, and also not entirely. In that first wave, Zerubbabel comes back. The way I learned it as a kid is silly, but it will stick with you. You can remember that Zerubbabel was the first one that came back, because when he came back to Jerusalem, all that was there was rubbable. Yeah. Okay. So he's the original one. He's the original leader of the group that comes back prior to Ezra, prior to Nehemiah. So 3 groups go out, essentially 3 groups come back. But Zerubbabel comes back in about 535 BC, right? Right around the end of Daniel's prophetic ministry time, whatever you want to call that. But the time in which Daniel was active as Cyrus takes over and destroys the Babylonian Empire and takes over, the Medes and the Persians take over, and he, Cyrus, allows the Jews to go back. The first place, that's Zerubbabel, okay? Ezra doesn't happen for another 130 years. So it's a while before we get to this next band of captives, but it's also 15 years before Zechariah, right? So Zerubbabel has been active for a while. He's been doing things, and just now, there's prophecies coming to him, which I find just fantastic from 2 standpoints. One, it means that Zerubbabel had very strong faith. He didn't have as much active prophecy going in. He had a job, he understood what that job was, and he went and just did it. And after 15 years of working hard, here comes Zechariah, here comes Haggai, and they're coming along to say, good job, but you got more to do. And they're giving him the encouragement from both sides, because Haggai's there to tell him, you got to do this temple, you got to rebuild this thing, you got to encourage the people to do the things. And Zechariah is here to talk a little bit more about the spiritual side, but still pushing this idea. He says, you got to build this temple. This temple is a big thing. I just think that's super cool, that it's not that he was handheld the whole way through. He had the strength of character to go about this for 15 years before he even had a prophet come directly to him. Okay, so we've got the idea of the 7 golden lampstands, right? No, because we just talked about Zerubbabel for 15 minutes. So what are the 7 golden lampstands? Well, here's the thing. Notice in verse 10 it says, for who has despised the day of small things, but these 7 will be glad when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. In other words, the measuring line, right? These are the eyes of the Lord which range to and fro throughout the earth. So there's your answer. That's what the 7 golden lampstands represent, is the 7 eyes of the Lord which range to and fro throughout the earth. Still clear as mud. Yes?
In verse 7, it addresses the mountain.
Yes.
If you think about it, the same word for mountain in Babylonian was the word for kingdom. They're not 2 different words. You refer to a kingdom, you would call it mountain. And so what he's saying is the mountain that is before Zerubbabel, that is the one that made the governor, the kingdom that made the governor, it's going to become a plain. So what's happening is the mountain, the kingdom, is going to be taken away.
In a lot of ways, this is reminiscent of the same kinds of language in Daniel 2, where Daniel 2 talks about the idea of these kingdoms that are coming before the coming kingdom of the Lord. And this is taking place in between, before the true stone comes, but it's still the same idea, right? The same idea is that the Lord's kingdom is more important than these physical kingdoms. So yes, the idea of the mountain, whether you want to talk about the idea of the Babylonian mountain, or whether you want to say this mountain of Zion, the mountain that Jerusalem is built on, the whole idea is that the physical nation or capabilities that they're up against or dealing with are of no import compared to the importance of God's presence and temple. And that's where we start to get into this idea of the 7 eyes, right? Because the 7 eyes is a really strange way of thinking about it. But I want to put a pin in that for just a second and turn over to Revelation, because I think if we do just some thinking here, we'll understand it. Now, whenever we use metaphorical language, whenever we use similes or metaphors or any sort of symbolic language, just verbal tricks that help us to understand things, we're using the familiar to describe the unfamiliar, right? So when we talk about the arm of the Lord, right, is it physically the well-toned, well-muscled arm that you see in the Sistine Chapel physically reaching down? No, the idea is we understand that God has an active presence that can do things much like we use our arms and hands to do things. Okay, using the familiar arms to describe the unfamiliar, something that we can't see. In the same way, when we start looking at Revelation, it's a little clearer how we get from the familiar to the unfamiliar. So think about this. In verse 16, he says, in his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was shining like the sun. Nope, I need to back up. Verse 12, then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and having turned I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the middle of the lampstands I saw one like a son of man. And then there's that whole description, right? And he's holding 7 stars and walking among the 7 golden lampstands, and he's got the sharp two-edged sword coming out of his mouth. There's this fantastic description of all these familiar things in a very unfamiliar arrangement. But in the answer, he says, as for the mystery of the 7 stars, this is verse 20, which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Okay, well, that's a pretty clear explanation, but even there, I think we might sometimes stop a little early. Because if we think about what is a church, is it a building? No, it's a group of people, right? So are the 7 lampstands a group of people or 7 groups of people? No, it's not. And here's where it gets weird, because if you look at chapter 2, when he says, therefore, remember, from verse 5, remember from where you have fallen, repent and do the deeds you did at first, or else I am coming to you and will remove your lampstand out of its place. Is he talking about removing the group of people? No. He's talking about removing his presence, God's presence, from those people. He would no longer be associated with them in that way. He would no longer approve of their actions. So the 7 golden lampstands, the churches that he's talking about there, is a way of talking about the presence of God. God's interaction with and direct relationship with that group of people. Because what makes a church is not a group of physical people. It is a group of people who have a relationship as a unit with God. And that presence is what's important. Now, understanding that, and then we go back in and look at the 7 eyes in Zechariah. When God is sending 7 eyes to and fro throughout the earth, do you think he can only see 7 viewpoints at a time around the earth? No. The whole point is he's everywhere. He's omnipresent. He is present. God's presence over the whole earth. God's ability to involve himself with the day-to-day dealings with all things while still being the God specifically of these people. That's what he's referring to here. These 7 eyes are referring to the presence of God. Now, they were used to thinking of the presence of God, or the Shemai, in terms of just the mercy seat, right? Just that one place over the Ark of the Covenant, which was at this point, who knows where. Nobody knows what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. But God's presence was never limited to the Ark of the Covenant, was it? There were multiple times in history where the Ark of the Covenant went somewhere else, and God's presence was still with the people because he was their God. So these 7 eyes are referring to God's presence with the people and with Joshua and with the priesthood and with the idea of rebuilding the temple so that they could do their duty, so that they could be right in a way that they couldn't have been before. Could they still be right before God during the captivity? Absolutely. He provided them ways of doing things, but in terms of following the law and actually doing the ceremonies the way they were supposed to, only now would they be able to get back to that. And so his presence would be with them in a way that hadn't been the case in a long time. And that was encouraging, or should have been encouraging to them. But also, as we look at that, we can look at that with hindsight and understand that using the familiar to describe the unfamiliar is exactly what the early Christians would have done in reverse. Because I used Revelation to explain Zechariah, but I guarantee you that the early Christians would have used Zechariah to explain Revelation. Because they had Daniel, they had Zechariah, they had Ezekiel, they had the law and the prophets that were meant to lead them to Christ. And that's what they would have been able to use because they would have been familiar. They would have known those stories and they would have known those texts. We as Christians focus a lot more on the New Testament, and rightly so, because that is the covenant under which we live. But sometimes our vision is skewed in that we are using the latter to explain the former, whereas that's not how it would have been to start with, right? They would have used these texts to explain how to understand Revelation. And I just think that's super cool. Any questions or comments before we move on? We've got a few more little pieces of chapter 4 here. Yeah?
Who are the anointed ones?
Yeah, so we've got some anointed ones, right? So, okay, moving on. So that was the comment that said it's time to move on. We've got a few minutes to talk about anointed ones. So, before we get to that, I want to talk about Numbers a little bit. Not the book, but about Numbers. We cover Numbers occasionally here, and it's the same concept every time, but not everybody's always here, and so it's good to just get a refresher sometimes, right? So, when we talk about the Jewish numbering system, did they count the same way we did? Yes. You start and you move up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's fine. But numbers meant something in a symbolic sense differently than we use them. So 3 would have been a divine number. 4 is the number of the cosmos. It's an earthly number. 7 or 12 are perfect, complete numbers. They're divine in a sense that it's heaven and earth together, right? So 3 plus 4 or 3 times 4. It's the number of God's people in the 12s. It's the number of God's kingdom in the 7s. You get 5, which is a complete or whole number, as you have 5 fingers or 5 toes under most circumstances. 6 is right between 5 and 7, so it's not a great number. It's incomplete. It's kind of an icky number. And as we move throughout these kinds of things, we see 7 and we glossed over the 7 lampstands and the 7 eyes, but that number itself was important to them. So when we get here and we say, here are the 2 anointed ones who are standing by the Lord of the whole earth. Now, we could take that and try to literally say, who are the 2 anointed ones? But I think even there, the number is symbolic. Because you could say, okay, well, who showed up at the Transfiguration? There were 2 people. Are those the 2 anointed ones? Or do we go, is it David because he had the everlasting kingdom promise, and maybe Abraham because he had the actual seed promise? Is it 2 other anointed people? We could probably go around in circles trying to figure out exactly who these 2 are. But what's the point that he says? First of all, he asks twice who these are, and then the angel looks at him and says, you don't know who these are? Which is great. It's just great, because of course he doesn't know who they are. He says, it's a tree, I don't know. He says, these are the two anointed ones who are standing by the Lord of the whole earth. So, to me, what that is indicating is a symbol of importance and a symbol of duty that is something that they are doing before the Lord, right? You don't anoint somebody so that they smell good. You anoint them towards a job, right? Aaron was anointed as high priest. David was anointed as king. Saul was anointed as king. He just lost the appointment because he didn't do what was right. But the idea is you anoint your kings, you anoint your high priests. I think it's symbolic of the two offices of priests and kings, as the idea of those who would serve before the Lord, but not an individual person by name. Now, I am not 100% certain on that, but because it says anointed and because you specifically anointed those two types of duties, I think it fits.
Isn't that one of the themes within some of the minor prophets, is that those two lines are going to converge?
They will intersect. Yes, and eventually what you see is that, who is standing among the 7 golden lampstands but the one who converges those lines? Jesus, right? Because the idea is he is physically of the Davidic line, but then takes over as high priest, as is explained later. He's not from the Levitical line, but he does take over in the sense of like Melchizedek, in the order of Melchizedek, right? He is still a priest of God. He is the intercessor for people. So yes, I think Jesus is the fulfillment of those two, but I think overall what is being pointed towards is this idea of God's presence with the people, because again, we have to look at first what was their interpretation at the time. What was important to them right now was that God was restoring his relationship with the people through their rebuilding of the temple, through their rededication of it, through their re-adherence to the law. He was setting things back to normal in many ways spiritually, which meant having people associated with the governance and rule and with the spiritual well-being of the people. That was what he was pushing them towards. Now, we have already talked about in previous lessons, and so I won't go over it again, that they never got back to having a king, right? That's not something physically that they ever got back to. But what they did have was a stable governance, and they had their priesthood, right? So they did have those two duty lines associated back with them, and that's, I think, what God is talking about here, in that his presence was going to ensure that they were taken care of, even though militarily they weren't able to defend themselves. And we talked about that as well, that at any point throughout the history from here on to the Romans, they could have been wiped off the map, but for God's protection. The whole idea of their continued existence was only because God took care of them, was only because he specially looked out for that remnant and made sure that it was ready for the coming of Christ. Okay, does that make sense? So 4 is a weird one. It requires a little bit more explanation, a little bit more thinking, but I think it's ultimately fairly straightforward, in that it's talking about the restoration of God's relationship with the people through the rebuilding of the temple and through the rededication of their adherence to the law. Questions, comments? Okay. Let's start reading a little bit of chapter 5. We're going to get into most of the discussion next week because I do not have time in 7 minutes to explain all of chapter 5 here. But I do think that there's some things that we should start thinking about, and then next week we will explain them. Then I lifted up my eyes again and looked, and behold, there was a flying scroll. And he said to me, "What do you see?" And I answered, "I see a flying scroll. Its length is 20 cubits, and its width is 10 cubits. Then he said to me, "This is the curse that is going forth over the face of the whole land. Surely everyone who steals will be purged away according to the writing on one side, and everyone who swears will be purged away according to the writing on the other side. I will make it go forth, declares the Lord of hosts, and it will enter the house of the thief and the house of the one who swears falsely by my name, and it will spend the night within that house and consume it with its timber and stones." Then the angel who was speaking with me went out and said before me, lift up now your eyes and see what this is going forth." And I said, "What is it?" And he says, "This is the ephah going forth." And again he said, this is their appearance in all the land. And behold, a lead cover was lifted up, and a woman sitting inside the ephah. And he said, this is wickedness. And he threw her down into the middle of the ephah, and cast the lead weight on its opening. And I lifted up my eyes and looked, and there were 2 women coming out with the wind in their wings. And they had wings like the wings of a stork. And they lifted the ephah between the earth and the heavens. And I said to the angel who was speaking with me, where are they taking the ephah? And then he said to me, to build a temple for her in the land of Shinar. And when it is prepared, she will be set there on her own pedestal. So, lots of weird things to talk about next week. But I do want you to think about a couple of things. He picks out 2 specific, and Seth will give it to you in just a second. He picks out 2 specific things, lying and swearing. And the first read, you might go, doesn't like foul language, but then he talks about it a little bit more when he says, those who swear falsely by my name, right? So talking about stealing and essentially false prophecy as the 2 things that he's targeting here. And then he gets into this whole idea of the ephah, but also there was this scroll, and I don't know if you noticed how big that thing was. But it's more than that, Mom. It's 20 cubits by 10 cubits. That's like 30 feet by 15 feet. That's massive. So this is a really big piece of paper that, I don't know, I still don't think there's people that make paper that big. Like, I've seen some big pieces of paper, but I don't think I've ever seen a 30-foot long by 15-foot long piece of paper that's one piece. So clearly, maybe we're not talking about something physical here. I think that's obvious. But the idea is, what's on that paper? It's written on both sides, and he says it's a curse. And yet that whole giant scroll is going to go inside multiple people's houses and consume everything all the way down to the timbers. Now, there are a lot of really cool ancient punishments, most of which came down to you'll be torn limb from limb and your house will be made a rubbish heap. This is God's equivalent of that. And I gotta say his is cooler. Because he's got a giant scroll that does it by itself, and it doesn't have to have soldiers, and also I don't know how the house fits the scroll because it's huge, but that's not important. The important idea is that God's got some judgments coming from 2 specific things, and then he illustrates another coming thing that he says is wickedness and is going to get its own temple. And we'll cover that next week. Seth.
Remind me what the ephah is?
An ephah, so it's like a unit of, you could think of it like a basket or like a
It's a bushel.
yeah, a bushel is probably the best way to put it. And so this particular ephah is kind of big and has a lead cover, which makes me think almost of like a, like a nuclear containment device, but that's not really what it is. It's just it's a big basket with a lid.
The version I was reading just said that.
Yeah. So it's also used as a unit. So what I was going to say originally is it's also used as a unit of measurement, right? So it's like 1 ephah of flour was worth a certain amount, and you see that come up in certain prophecies. But the idea is they had a relatively standard size basket, and so you use that as a unit of measurement and say, okay, this basket of flour is worth whatever. So yeah, it's a basket. But this one has a person in it, so just to be confusing. All right, any other questions, comments? All right, we'll end just a few minutes early just because it's a good stopping point.